One of the prevailing assumptions that we see even today is that customers of Microsoft are still treating M365 like an app. We keep walking into organizations with hundreds or maybe a couple of thousand users, and there'll be dozens in some cases of global admin accounts inside that environment.
So when I walk into a client site, when I start working with them, I quickly realize like how many global administrators that they have, like far too many global administrators in the Microsoft 365 environment. And when you check their on-premises environment, sometimes you see legacy authentication still on, legacy protocols are still active.
Microsoft 365 is now the operational backbone of Australian enterprises from public sector to health, financial services and beyond. But many organisations still treat it like an application that Microsoft manages for them. The reality is more nuanced. Microsoft secures the cloud, but configuration, identity boundaries, privilege models, and governance inside your tenant, that's your responsibility. Today, we unpack whether organisations are operating M365 with the same discipline once applied on-prem and to their data centres. And if not, where are the blind spots? And how do you fill those gaps? I'm iTnews contributing editor, Nate Cochrane, and with us to discuss these critically important issues in your business are Shehan Perera, Microsoft MVP and Identity and Endpoint Architect at Bastion Technology Services, and Andrew McAllister, Vice President of the APAC region for CoreView. Andrew, let's start with you. Would it be correct to say that many organisations still assume Microsoft has issues such as identity and privilege covered for them?
Yeah, I think it is, Nate, because 15 years ago, when everybody was thinking about moving their Microsoft workloads to the cloud, it was a very different beast then to what it is today. And one of the prevailing assumptions that we see even today is that customers of Microsoft are still treating M365 like an app, because back then it was. Today, it is no longer an app. It is a series of complex services and workloads in the cloud all strung together. The truth is that the organization or the customer of Microsoft ultimately are responsible for the security and the hardening and the operation of this really critical piece of cloud infrastructure. So if you were operating servers 15 years ago, you'd never put a server into the cloud without hardening it. Our question and challenge is, why wouldn't you have that same approach with the M365 tenant? And the result that we see now is that the tenants that customers are responsible for are not being managed properly. They are not being backed up correctly. And organizations are deferring to easy privilege management models rather than taking a fine-grained approach.
So let's get an operational view then. Shehan, I'd like to bring you in here. When you walk into a new client and look at their tenants, what's the first red flag you look for?
I would say often the basic hygiene issues that the tenants would have. So when I walk into a client site, when I start working with them, I quickly realize like how many global administrators that they have, like far too many global administrators in the Microsoft 365 environment. And when you check their on-premises environment, sometimes you see legacy authentication still on, legacy protocols are still active, which still affecting the cloud at some point as well. When I dig deep in the Entra policies configurations, I see a lot of conditional access policy issues. Maybe they have set up some policies, especially like to block basic authentication that the Exchange had like a few years ago. Maybe it's in the report mode because they're still not ready to block them straight away. So these are like big red flags I see as I walk into customer sites. So I see a big theme here, like best practices are not followed, and also the frameworks are not adopted properly in the environments as well.
Andrew, Microsoft guidance suggests no more than 4 global admins, but in reality, how often do you see that?
Almost never, Nate. So their framework is very deliberate, and it's meant to scale to the most complex Microsoft environments in the world with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of users. Yet we keep walking into organizations with hundreds or maybe a couple of thousand users, and there'll be dozens in some cases of global admin accounts inside that environment. And it's really being driven by organizations stepping on the wrong side of that security versus convenience line. A lot of organizations are still defaulting to this idea that just-in-time privilege is okay. But the truth is during that period of time, that admin is still wandering around inside your Microsoft environment with an enormous blast radius. And so we are really challenging organizations to think about true least privilege in the sense of not just-in-time privilege, but really just enough privilege to be able to achieve the administrative tasks they need to do to keep the tenant online.
Shehan, in your lived experience, seeing this sort of thing every day, what percentage of organizations could quickly and confidently answer the question of who exactly can become an admin?
Probably a very few. So there can be highly privileged other roles as well, as same as the global administrator access in this case. IT teams need to use Microsoft Graph in most cases to dig deep to understand who are the users and at what time they got the elevated permissions and whatnot. I see a bit of a skill gap in this area as well, because you need to understand what sort of APIs you need to run, as well as what sort of permissions to get the right outcome as well.
So let's make it real then. If someone compromised an on-prem Active Directory account tomorrow, how worried should the cloud and security teams be?
I would say very, because probably 99% of the organizations today are running on hybrid. That means you manage your on-premises AD and still that's the source of truth, and you have synchronized your users and your groups into Entra. In that way, you give permissions to your mailbox, maybe to the Teams, SharePoint sites and whatnot. The recommendation from Microsoft is, yes, you can synchronize your users, not a problem, but don't synchronize your privileged role accounts. Keep them in the cloud as in-cloud accounts. Because as you can understand, this will minimize the attack surface and act as a hard cutoff in a lateral movement situation. But again, most organizations would do this as a convenience, and this itself is a big bonus to the attackers if they're inside the organization.
So how quickly could a bad actor, once they're in, metastasize or move laterally through an organization? And what would some of those telltale signs be?
Very anomalous activities when it comes to IP addressing. And you can see most probably conditional access policies being deactivated or changed. And also we call it the impossible travel, because in the reports you would see different countries popping up with different sign-in attempts. So they are the telltale signs of, yes, there may be someone inside the organization right now.
Andrew, I just want to bring you in there for a moment. What's the Microsoft and CoreView guidance with regards to detecting and then acting on some of these signs of lateral movement?
Yeah, so Microsoft have a huge amount of tooling and reporting capability and signals. At CoreView, we say you need to be able to extend beyond the native Microsoft tooling to be able to achieve real-time detection and response on some of these challenges, because otherwise you're going to have a team of full-time engineers just focusing on trying to understand these problems and then looking for signals themselves. So it's a real intersection of bringing people, process, and technology together. To kind of riff off what Shehan is talking about, CoreView really has a strong philosophy that we don't need to also accept the default Microsoft position on privilege. Microsoft ship with a ton of out-of-the-box administrative profiles and personas that you can attach to your administrators that still carry an enormous amount of privilege that might be unnecessary. So we are talking about being able to really come down to the task-based privilege model, so that you're only ever allowing specific tasks to be run rather than entire privilege models to be assigned to a person or an account. And we also want to be able to help your organizations achieve real-time visibility. So a number of the challenges that Shehan has mentioned, you only find them if you're looking for them. And we have a philosophy that you should be able to detect these things in real time and have governance policies that make sure that when they are detected, something proactive is done about it.
Okay, so if privilege is one side of the equation, configuration drift is the other. Andrew, there tend to be three typical causes of configuration drift, all related to change. Just walk us through those.
So I'd really like to answer that question by first posing a bit of an analogy. So think about your Microsoft 365 tenant like a glass of water. So the water inside the glass is the data inside your tenant that you are constantly looking to protect, whereas the glass itself is your M365 tenant. And by that, I mean, if you zoomed in on the glass, it would just be a series of these thousands of Microsoft configurations that are governing the integrity of the glass. And so when you consider a glass, you do not want cracks in that glass. And we like to think about configuration changes as being small fissures or cracks that start to form inside that glass. And that's what ultimately leads to the data or the water leaking out of the glass. And there are three main ways that these cracks can form, or these configuration changes can take place. The first is probably obvious. Your administrative and operational teams that are responsible for Microsoft are constantly changing M365 configurations because that's their job. They are responsible for adapting to your business needs and making sure that your Microsoft platform is configured in a way that you can operate your day-to-day business. So it's not uncommon to see many configuration changes coming from inside the organization. The question you have to ask there really is, has a good change management process been adhered to make sure that that change is in fact acceptable? The second way that configuration changes happen, and in fact it's the most common and often the most problematic way, is that you'll wake up tomorrow morning and Microsoft will have arbitrarily made some configuration changes to your tenant. This is again, not nefarious. Microsoft have the best intentions in mind here, but they don't know how your tenant is configured today and how their configuration changes that they are deploying into your environment are necessarily going to impact that. The third method is if you have a malicious actor inside your tenant, the first thing that they're typically going to do is make some configuration changes. They are going to do things like switching off mailbox auditing rules, and they are going to tamper with your conditional access policies to make it easier for them to laterally move around your M365 environment undetected. So this really speaks to the need to harden the tenant and understand what a good configuration looks like in the first place, and be able to detect when these configurations change, even if they are well-intentioned, so that you then have the power to accept and roll back configurations and see things that are no longer adhering to your golden image that you have of the tenant.
Shehan, you've seen a few cracked glasses in your life. I understand you had a real-world conditional access drift case study that you wanted to share with us. Can you tell us what happened?
Usually any organization would have country-related conditional access policies. So whenever someone is flying to another country, they would have request, I specifically need access to Microsoft 365 resources from this country. So this organization had a special exemption group where the user would be put into, and that will be expired automatically. So anyone doesn't need to go there and take them out manually. So that's all happening nicely, and the administrators doesn't need to do any policy changes as well, because it can be critical. So one help desk engineer put the user into the conditional access policy exemptions, but not to this defined group. So country access has been enabled for a couple of weeks, even after the user came back from this said country. After a while, the security team has noticed sign-in attempts from the same country IP address, and the investigation started because it's been determined as a blocked country by default. So 3 issues were identified. First of all, the help desk engineer had conditional access policy administrator access, which he shouldn't have in the first place. And also it's a violation of just enough access least privileges as well. The instructions have been given to put the user into this group, but not to the conditional access policy exemption. So that's been violated as well. And also the policy recovery was really slow to get to that restored policy to get up and running again, because they had to trace back to the policy, who has done the change, when this happened, when this started popping up. So it took a couple of weeks to get it back to the normal and, really close the job. So yeah, so that's the classic examples why the organizations need to be on top of their guardrails and to understand drifts when it happens, but not after happened after a couple of weeks or so.
So taking it then from the specific to the general, if conditional access policies are tampered with, how quickly, in your experience, Shehan, could most organizations restore their 365 tenants? And here I'm talking about the configuration and not just the data.
Some organizations, yes, they are being creative, because sometimes Microsoft doesn't give you the tools that you that out of box, I would say. So they need to use, again, things like logic apps to understand, create your workflows, and then it will spit out reports time to time. Some organizations would have detection rules going in their SIEM, for example, Sentinel. So conditional access policy has got a table as well. If we talk about the KQL, those sort of endpoint security side of things. So they know when this happens, they would get a detection alert coming in. So it would take probably, I would say, a couple of days to weeks, depending on how skillful they are and how proactive they are.
So we've heard a lot then about what can go wrong in an M365 tenancy, but just stripping out the fear, uncertainty, and doubt for a moment, what does good actually look like in order to revert back to that golden state? Andrew, perhaps you can give us a sense of where are the trusted frameworks and blueprints that people should be looking at?
One of the best baselining tools that you can use for your M365 environment is actually provided through the Microsoft CIS benchmarking and framework. The challenge is, how do I actually compare my production tenant to what good should look like? Because it's one thing to get a manual that shows all of the configurations today. It's another thing to, go through them one by one and understand whether I am in compliance with them or not. The Australian Signals Directorate, ISM, and then the Essential 8 framework that talk about best practices from a cyber perspective. They've all got very practical recommendations that would help you adhere to those benchmarks. So we often, when we're talking about configurations, we talk about baselining and having a golden image that you are constantly comparing your tenant to, so you can understand when you're starting to drift away from that golden image and be able to bring it back into a good compliance state.
Shehan, what's your North Star when it comes to looking at some of these methodologies? What guides you when you're talking to clients?
A good place to start is the ASD, Australian Signals Directorate Blueprint, because it has got relevant parts of Microsoft 365 configs pretty much well defined in their documentation. There can be instructions for, if you're looking for Entra ID, Microsoft Teams, Exchange Online, and so on. So they got advice for all those sections. So say if you get Entra ID, then it will have, okay, this is how you set conditional access policies. These are the conditional access policies you need, like critical right now in your organization. And this is how you basically block access and so on. But what they always say is that's the baseline. So you have to build your organization specific rule set, hardening configuration on top of that. And say if you can't align with that specific policy or setting mentioned by ASD, for an example, then at least you need to make sure that you have your own risk analysis done. What happens if we enable this rather than disable? I think Andrew mentioned pretty much everything about Essential 8. It's pretty much the package that comes with all the critical guardrails that organization requires. So if you can't be on the maturity level 3 today in Essential 8, you can start, you can be at maturity level 1 and then start your way up. I think, and also CIS benchmarks as well, level 2, level 3, depending on your organization situation. These will help the organizations to build that golden image tenancy, document them, and then go from there.
If someone watching this wants to pressure test their own environment, what should they do first, Shehan?
I would start with a identity secure score because it's free in the tenancy. It's continuously showing up a number, and it will say why you have this percent right now. These are the things that passed at this time, and what are the failure points. And it will show you if there's a failure, the reason of the failure, and how to fix that as well. That spans across your privilege identity management, your zero trust conditional access policies, global administrators, you name it. So that's 365 and Entra. So if you're using Microsoft Intune, for an example, I'm going a bit off tangent, but I'll come back to connect back to Entra. Target a small group of users and their devices and apply a security baseline with the recommended settings. Again, these recommended settings have been, it's a mix of CIS policy and NIST configuration NIST standards created by Microsoft security experts. So as soon as you enable that to your pilot group, you will very quickly realize if you have any legacy protocols enabled or legacy authentication methods enabled, because they can and they will affect your 365 environment at some point. And there can be devices which are not compliant enough to access sensitive data in your 365 environment. So that's a very good place to start as a pressure test.
Andrew, what are your recommendations for someone who wants to pressure test their environment?
From a privilege perspective, I think understanding your current state from privilege exposure perspective inside Microsoft 365 is really, really important. How many admins do you have today? How many of those admins are global admins? A lot of Microsoft customers we speak to just can't answer those questions without running some type of health check or diagnostic across their environment. So there's a lot of technical debt, a lot of admin accounts that are created for a particular project or point in time that are just not cleaned up. And being able to understand that current state and do something about it is a really good starting point. The second topic that we've talked about is really around the configuration resilience. And so we like to talk to our customers about securing a point in time comparison between your current production M365 environment versus a framework, right? Even if you haven't landed on the framework that or golden image that you are aspiring towards, let's start somewhere. So imagine if you could compare your production tenant today against what the Microsoft CIS benchmarks say and see where all of the differentials are. So we like to start with those two health checks. And then the last topic, I guess, that we've discussed really relates more back to operational resilience of the M365 tenant. The reason why privilege is being overlooked and the reason why configurations are being neglected are because the operators and security folk responsible for M365 do not have enough hours in the day just to do the basics and keep the lights on inside this very complex ecosystem. So where you can look for efficiencies and all of the current manual tasks that are keeping your M365 administrators busy and look to automate and build efficiencies into them, it's going to free up more time to spend looking at the more important side of the fence, arguably, which is how are we keeping the thing secure in the first place. So administrative health check, configuration baselining, and operational resilience, looking for efficiencies inside the tenant, are three really great ways to get started on this journey.
So my takeaway is then that Microsoft 365 isn't just software that you consume anymore, it's infrastructure that you operate. And therefore the question isn't whether you've got E5 or whether backup is in place or whatever it is you think your reseller or Microsoft is doing. The questions I think people watching now, taking away from what you and Shehan have said, is, do you know your privilege exposure? Do you know your configuration state? And knowing both of those, could you still restore back to good if it changed? And to me, they sound like operational discipline questions. And discipline is rarely glamorous, but it's what keeps your infrastructure standing over the long haul. Andrew and Shehan, I really want to thank you for all your provocative and yet grounded insights today. And if this conversation raised questions about your own tenant state, hit up the QR free demo code and give CoreView a go. Thank you very much, Andrew and Shehan.